Let's talk a little bit about the problem of suffering. As we look around the world, we can see that there is a lot of suffering. People are in pain, people are hungry, terrible things going on around us, and that's a tragic thing. But sometimes people will say, well, how can we reconcile the suffering that we see around us with a perfectly good and all-powerful God? They'll say, if there's suffering, then either one, God is not good because he doesn't care and he doesn't stop the suffering, or two, he's not all-powerful, maybe he just can't prevent the suffering. And so how can we reconcile an all-good and all-powerful God with the suffering that we see around us? I don't actually think it's that difficult. I think that the explanation is that there's something more important than preventing suffering. And I'll give you the perfect example of this sort of thing. So God loved us and he sent his son on a mission of mercy to rescue us. And Jesus suffered greatly, more than any of us will ever have to. Now, did God not care about the fact that his son was suffering? Of course he cared. He loved his son, loves his son. Could he not have prevented it? Of course he could have prevented it. But this was necessary. Jesus' sacrifice was necessary for us to be able to have hope of eternal life in heaven. And God wanted us to be able to have that. And Jesus was willing to do that, to be the lamb that we needed. And so I think that's how we can reconcile these things. Now, as we look around and see the suffering around us, I think that we can point to kind of a more proximal explanation for some of what happens. Sometimes suffering could be a punishment from God. We can see that in the scriptures, sometimes God would strike people because of their sin. So I don't know how often that happens, but that could be an explanation. And so if a person does something that they ought not to, this could be their punishment. It could be the result of people's own actions, that God allows people to make choices, and sometimes they choose badly. What if a person becomes drunk and goes and drives in a car and gets in a serious accident? The person who was drunk might be seriously injured, maybe for the rest of his or her life. And really, that was because of that person's choice. Or what if somebody else was injured or killed as a result of that person's decision to drive while intoxicated? Well, once again, that's a tragic thing, but that's the result of that person's choice. And God, it seems, wants to give people the freedom to be able to choose wrong, even if that produces negative consequences. Well, what about things that aren't a person's choice? So like, what if there's a hurricane? What if there's a tornado, earthquake, things like that? Well, I think that that's just the result of the fact that we are no longer living in a perfect world. The world that God created was perfect. There was nothing bad in it at all. There was no suffering in it at all. But the world that we see around us is not the world that God made. This world has been corrupted by sin and cursed. And so, we're not living in a paradise anymore. We're living in the world that we see around us. Now, I think that understanding suffering would be more difficult for religious people, for Christians, if when they looked in the scriptures, everything was bright and rosy all the time. If everything always worked out and God's people never had to go through any suffering, everything always was pleasant all the time, and then we look around at the world here, then we would go, I don't understand what's going on. But of course, that's not the case. You can look in the scriptures and there's all sorts of suffering that goes on there. Sometimes people murder somebody else. People may be starving. Someone may sexually assault someone. There may be persecution, all kinds of suffering that goes on. And so that's a consequence of the fact that, we're living in this imperfect world here. Jesus said, you're going to have trouble in this world. But at the same time, we're also told that God can use even things that are bad to build us up and strengthen us. So there is kind of a silver lining, you might say, that as we go through suffering, if we go through it with the right attitude, we can become stronger as a result.